I'm going to turn the microphone on, but I will tell you I'm a very down-to-earth, natural person, so I'm very open to questions. I'll either answer the question right away, defer it to later in the presentation, or say I don't know the answer and we'll get it for you. So don't be afraid to shout out if there's something that you really need some information on. Now, the one question I didn't ask before I come was what was the dress code. So I will tell you that while I'm dressed pretty formally, I do own a pair of jeans and I am a local person, so I would have probably done something a little bit different, but that's okay. So I have a lot to talk about tonight and hopefully inform you. We are going to go through a lot of slides, but I hopefully will enjoy, and you will enjoy what we're going to do. I have the presentation basically separated into three parts. Who am I and where did I come from and what is this organization? But that's really not the main part. We're going to go over the New York Reforming the Energy Vision, which is a process and initiative going on in the state of New York. We're going to talk about some of the content, the supporting programs for that, which is really the meat of what's going on. And then I have the last session of industry trends and discussion. So I'm really open to, let's say, what's going on in Pennsylvania, what's going on in other states, and how might it apply to us. So we'll start. Who is the Electric Power Research Institute? So if you're not familiar with EPRI, this is the company I worked for about 13 years. Prior to that, I did work for the GPU Energy, which was MedEd, for 20 years. What happened in 1965, I believe, some of you may remember this, I was a little girl at the time, at least I try to think it that way, is that there was a big blackout in New York City in the Northeast. And everybody was traumatically impacted by that. And so the government, the federal government, had said, you know what, we've got to really do more research in the area, and we're going to put a tax on everybody and have the federal government run research. And what happened was some university professors and some leads of the utility said, we don't think that's going to work. We are the ones that really know what needs to be done, and give us a chance, and that chance was the Electric Power Research Institute. So our organization was basically introduced in 1972, and I want to make sure you know that I'm not up here to advertise because we're a not-for-profit organization. We're independent, and that means we're objective. We do not lobby at all. We don't take a stand as far as policy. We do testify in front of Congress and sometimes in front of regulatory state legislative and regulatory bodies. And what we really focus on is not the policy issues, but the science. We do research on how we can move the industry forward for the benefit of the public. And that's the important thing. It isn't for one entity, it's for everybody, large and small. And so everything that we do is to support that initiative. So as I mentioned, we're not for profit, we're not earning any profit out of it. And the other thing that's very unique about our organization is we're considered one of the best collaboratives in the industry. And the reason why that is instead of a PPL, a MedEd, a Con Edison out of New York, each doing their own research and perhaps putting millions of dollars on that and duplicating efforts, our organization brings all of those entities together. We learn from each other, share information, and that cuts down on the cost. And so that collaborative is very, very important. Our members go across the world, actually. We have over 450 members and participants from 30 countries. Our members in the United States generate 90% of the electricity in the United States. So not everybody in the United States is a member of ours, but that's okay. And nearly 25% of our funding does come from international companies. And if you've been following the industry a little bit, you'll see that there's a lot of neat things going across the world, whether it's in Europe or whether it's in Southeast Asia or anywhere else. We've got to all learn from each other, and that's where we are. Within EPRI, we have several sectors. The power delivery and utilization, which is really the lines, okay? The transmission lines, the distribution lines, and everything having to do with energy within your homes, customer side of things. We also have nuclear. We also study generation. We also study the environment, And we also have an entity which is technology innovation that looks way out in the future, not just the 2-3 years. We're looking at things that really are way out there. Tonight we're going to focus on what I have circled up there, which is the power delivery and utilization, energy and environment, and the technology innovation, because that's what New York is focused on right now. So I have a couple quick questions just to see where we are. And this is going to go fast. I'm just going to ask you to raise your hand when I call out the letter that you think the answer is. So of all the new generation capacity added to the United States electrical grid in 2015, what percentage was solar? And I'm going to ask you to raise your hands. Is it going to be 5.5%, 13.6%, 29.4%, and 17.2%? This is new generation added. How many people, raise your hand, think it's 5.5 or letter A? Okay, a couple of you. How about B, 13.6? More? 29.4, C? And 17.2. Okay, so the answer is 29.4, which is a pretty significant amount. It's not total generation, but what's new and what newly is added. So while in the United States we still only have 2% of solar, what's being added is almost 30%. So that's pretty good, and that was in 2015, and that seems to be increasing. Another quick question. By how much has the price of American wind power decreased since the 1980s? 60, 80, 90, or 70%? How many people think it's 60%, letter A? See, now you're afraid to look at those lower numbers, I can tell. Okay, letter B, 80%, a couple more, 90%, a lot more, and D, 70%. Still a few. And the answer is 90%. Wind energy is now the cheapest form of power in some parts of the country, with new power purchase agreements in 2016 averaging only 2 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, but you got to remember that wind doesn't blow all the time. So another and last quick question, just to get a feel for who you are. Who do you think is officially responsible for the reliability of electricity at your meter location? So wherever you have your home, who's responsible to get that electricity in a reliable fashion to that meter? A, is it you? B, is it a generation supplier that you pay? Could it be a third-party vendor like your solar supplier, a distribution utility, or all of the above? How many people think it's you? Aha. Pretty smart, huh? A generation supplier, third-party vendor, distribution utility, and all of the above. Okay, the answer is it's the distribution utility. In most states across the United States, the state regulators or legislators basically assign the reliability to that distribution. So in other words, you've probably heard this, provider of last resort. You know, First Energy or Med-Ed or PPL may or may not actually supply your generation, and you may get it from somebody else, but if that fails, they're responsible for getting it to your meter. No matter what, they're responsible if you're connected. So let's get on to tonight's agenda and the New York Reforming the Energy Vision. I got a good feel now for who you are, and I'm going to try to make this applicable for those of you that know a little more and know a little less, so don't be afraid. There's no silly question. First of all, New York, right after Hurricane Sandy, had to address a lot of complaints from the citizens of New York. And the way in which the governor and the administration and the rest of the state responded to that were many different avenues and initiatives, but one was called the Reforming the Energy Vision. And it was really also to put New York on the map as far as becoming an energy leader. I talked to Ray ahead of time, and Ray, thank you for inviting me as the speaker tonight. We talked a little about this, and I'm a nonpartisan, so I don't want to get into politics, but another reason for this initiative to go forward is California and New York are sort of competing to be the leader in energy. And whoever gets that top position, of course, may benefit politically. So obviously some of the governors are interested in moving forward with their careers, so they want to be the leaders. There's challenges to that, and there's also benefits to that. And hopefully, and I think the public is benefiting to moving forward with some of these things. but there's also some challenges involved in putting such a big initiative together. So what they're really trying to do is make it such that customers have more choice in what goes on in their energy management. In fact, not only within their own homes and the way you use things and the way you have rates, but also if you'd want to install solar, distributed generation, any kind of thing like that, that you will have the opportunity to do that. And that's essentially what the New York Reforming the Energy Vision is, making the policy go forward such that people have more choices and can get access to more choices in energy. So this thing was actually initiated in April of 2014. Now, the fun part about this is that they actually thought that a year and a half later, everybody would have access to all these renewables. They were very aggressive in their timelines, and I'm going to show you a little bit later why things started to slow down a little bit. Things are still moving forward, and it's very assertive as a state, but there's a lot of issues related to all of this that need to be addressed. Because why? Because every single one of you in here wants to be able to flip your switch for electricity and have that electricity go on. And whether you own some of this distributed energy resources or whether your neighbor does, you do not want that reliability to go away. And so there's so many things that have to be figured out before it's a free-for-all from everybody. So this whole thing was initiated, as I mentioned, in April 2014. And I had the goals there for it, and as time went on, it evolved. It evolved such that the current goals of the initiative have really gone a little bit further than what they originally went through. So for instance, they started talking about the cost of electricity. You know, it's nice to do all these fancy things, but if it costs me 3 times as much, I'm not so sure I'm going to want to do it. So it has to be somewhat affordable. It has to be clean energy. That's a big initiative in New York. They want to definitely cut down on their gas emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions. They want choice. They actually want to improve the infrastructure. Those lines out there are getting pretty old. They were built decades ago. And so you have to do something about that, and because it will age and deteriorate over time. So they want to make sure that they're improving that infrastructure and also designing it for the technology of the future, which we're going to talk about a little bit. And then we also want to have, and definitely in New York, this is a big deal, economic development and new jobs. Also protecting the natural resources, and for sure, making sure that we have a resilient energy system. So it not only has to be reliable, but when those big things happen out there, whether it's a hurricane or any other type of thing, it has to be able to bounce back fast. Because you and I now really expect that our electricity is going to be there for us. And it is so much a part of our lives right now that without it, I'm not sure that most people could function very well. It's not that, hey, I was a little girl, we didn't have everything when we were small, and you know, we didn't have all of the microwaves and everything else. But this generation coming up is always anticipating and relying on technology and electricity. Whether you go to the gas pump, you try to get gas in your car, how's that run? Electricity. Whether you go to the grocery store, everything, if you go there and something goes wrong with the computer system, it's like everything fell apart. You ever lose track, when you ever go to a place where your cell phone's not working and the cell tires aren't working, it feels like the whole world's falling apart. We're so now relying on all of these technologies that it's difficult to think of a world without that. And so it's very important as we move forward that we not only advance the technology to make it easier for ourselves, but we don't become so dependent in a way that it's not resilient enough to come back in case there is some kind of disaster. So in this process in New York that started in 2014, they had the commission come in and they had a white paper written, and there were lots of comments, and they came out with the order in 2014. And that summer, I was part of that process. I'll never forget it, because one of the main things that New York tried to do was to get everybody involved and let everybody have a voice. Well, it was very interesting, because in that process, that can slow things down a little bit. So they had different working groups. I happened to be on the customer working group. There was some on the technology working group, and then there were subgroups. And they were trying to move very fast. And if you'll notice, in 2015, they had a target for this track one, which I'm going to explain, to actually come out in 2014. It came out a year later. Why? Well, I can tell you, I was part of the customer working group, and anybody that wanted to be on it could be on it. There were over 100 different organizations just on that one working group. They would have several different calls every single week. At the beginning of the call, believe it or not, they would do a roll call. That took 15 to 20 minutes. Now think about how, that would really stretch out the process. So as time went on and they went through that whole regime in that summer, it was actually very interesting because they did get some things done. The working groups came up with presentations to go back to the PSC about all the different concerns that each of the different stakeholders had. Everybody had a different opinion about things, so they had to basically summarize all of that. And they brought it back to the PSC, and then in 2015, they came out with their first track or PSC order on what to do next. And then in 2016, now by this time it was supposed to have all been done, right? Of 2016, and then they came out with more things on policy, which I'll talk about, some pilots, some implementation plans, and then they started a different process for stakeholders and said, you know what, we're going to have smaller groups and you're going to be invited in. Let us know if you're interested, but it isn't a free-for-all that people show up when they want to and may not be interested every week, and they're really not committed to the process. So they actually did improve the process, which I'm going to show you in another slide, and how they're still informing everyone and including everyone, but they don't have hundreds of people every single time trying to get something done. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on. It started in 2017 and then 2018. So I was talking about this stakeholder thing and everybody having a voice. Because everybody, we all have our opinions. We all think we know it all. And I can guarantee you, if I ask the same question to all of you about who should pay for what in electricity, all of you would have a different answer, okay? But what they did do is say, okay, in this process, we're going to involve the utilities and ask them to update the stakeholders every so often. And so depending on the topic, and you'll see the topics on the left-hand side there, this is basically the schedule for last year of how many meetings and conference calls they allowed to basically inform people where they were in the process, and then have a Q&A, and people were allowed to say what they wanted to say. So it was actually much better using that kind of process, and things got a little bit faster that way. And if you remember the stakeholders too, everybody should have a voice in some of these. There's different organizations with different interests, and you really should do a comprehensive look at how it impacts different people. But once again, you can do that by coordinating the efforts a little bit better so that it goes a little faster. Now, the other thing that happened with the New York REV process was, if you'll notice in the center here, I do have a pointer, that's right. Right there, that's called REV. That was the initial proceeding. It was an official proceeding. If you know anything about regulatory commissions, they put a proceeding together, there might be a white paper, then they ask for input. So then utilities and all the other parties are allowed to write official comments. That all comes into the commission. And then the commission may have back and forth between, and then there may be a first order or a draft order that comes out, and then you may have additional comments coming in. So that REV process actually blossomed into numerous other official proceedings. Because what happened is they started to identify the issues, and it's not as easy as it looks. And I'm going to go into that a little bit. So while everybody wants to move forward and advance, there are some issues to address that you just can't flippantly say, oh, this is how we'll handle it, and then hundreds of thousands of people are negatively impacted. So they actually had a proceeding for each one of these circles, which means the commission put out some information, there were comments officially put back and forth, and then eventually the commission would come back with an order that would say, okay, here's how we want to move forward. Now just think about what that entailed. Now you know why it went from 2014 and is still going on today. Because every utility that I'm aware of basically initiated and created a whole new department to address this. Because there were filings that had to be made by the utilities, there's mandates. And then think about all the third parties that are interested and they have comments. It's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It's a lot of work. And even the commission staff were completely, I mean, I saw them, they looked tired. Because they're the ones that have to organize all of this, and they were told they weren't allowed to take a vacation basically for a couple years. So everybody was working hard. It wasn't one party, one stakeholder, it was everybody working hard at all these different issues that needed to be addressed. Now the beginning of New York Rev essentially was to address two different questions. The first question is, as you get and you encourage more distributed energy resources, which is the solar, the wind, the CHP, all these things that we can now have in our facilities, our houses, the businesses can do, what's the role of the distribution utility? What are they supposed to do? Who's supposed to organize this? And I'm going to get into that a little bit. The second question is, what other changes needed to be made on a policy basis that would encourage all of this and make the right things happen? So for those of you that are really technically in there, forgive me for my layman's view as to what this means. Right now on the system, there's a whole bunch, maybe hundreds of generating stations, what they call utility scale. They're the big ones. They're the tightest stations or the Susquehanna nuclear plants. And traditionally, the utilities had owned them. Now it's a little bit different. It's more competitive. But somebody has to tell them when to turn on and when to turn off. Because we don't always use our electricity. We use our electricity most of the time during the day. Some businesses use it at night and overnight, but most of the electricity is used during the day. So people have to basically dispatch these utility scale generation to make sure it's available when it is needed. That's traditionally what has happened. Now we're going to enter into you saying, okay, I have solar panels on my house, and when I'm not needing that electricity, I would like to sell it back to the utility. And the utility now has to figure out, well, is it cheaper to buy from the large plant, or is it cheaper to buy from your solar panel? And it's very complicated. So if you think about it, those large plants, there's maybe a couple hundred of them dispatched in New York State. But if you open it up to every single customer being able to install some kind of generation on their house and selling it back and forth, you're now talking about thousands, if not millions, of transactions and trying to figure out what is supposed to happen at every second in order to provide electricity for everybody in this room. That gets really complicated. So what they had to decide is who's going to do that? Who's going to be responsible? And this track one, which was supposed to determine this, said several different things. It said in the beginning, the distribution company, PPL, MedEd, will be responsible for that. And they wanted to be, because they say, we know the distribution lines. Who knows it better than us? We know we're going to be able to keep track of all of this. So that's one thing. And then a couple other things that this first order came out with that might be interesting to you is that customers and third-party suppliers like solar folks, wind folks, demand response, big entities that try to aggregate, they're going to have access to the utility system planning information. And I'll explain that in a little bit, why they would need that access. There's also going to be access to individual customer usage so people know who to go to and what might benefit them. There's some caveats to that. And also they had to decide, well, who would be allowed to own this distributed energy resource? Should a utility be allowed to own it? Then they're really competing with everyone else, and don't they have more of a market power? So what New York decided, and this is not the same in every state, but what New York decided is that the utilities in New York would not be able to own distributed energy resources with 4 exceptions. They would be allowed to own energy storage. They would be allowed to put in some kind of distributed energy resource if it would impact to the benefit low and medium income customers, because other vendors wouldn't go to them. They would be allowed to install it if it was beneficial for the whole system and made the cost go down, and they would be able to install it and own it for a pilot program. But that's it. And this is a big deal, because what it means is the utilities can't make money off of that. That's a huge deal. So that was a big thing that happened in New York. And then also there were other large-scale things that had to happen, attention to low and medium income customers, and a few other things that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. They also said that each utility had to file a major plan for the next 5 years on how this is all going to be implemented, and then the utilities were also supposed to get together and work on joint issues. Now you may say, wow, this really does sound complicated. Yeah, it is. And let me show you the joint utilities getting together in New York. They had to break it down into all these subject matters, and each one of those boxes addresses a different issue that needs to be resolved before you can really move forward here. So I'm not going to go over, and you're welcome, all those individual ones, but it's quite a bit that needs to be done. Track 2 was the order on policy, and this essentially talked about rates, how you're going to charge customers. So a little example here is you have solar PV on your house, and you're saying, okay, I'm not buying any electricity from the electric company, but I want to sell it back. So that's okay. So you use your own electricity, you're not buying in it, you're going to sell it back. Oh, how are you going to sell it back? It's going to go through the lines, right? Well, who should pay for those lines? If you're going to make money by selling it back to the utility and you're going to use those lines, are you going to pay for that? Or is that your neighbor across the street who doesn't have solar pay for that? We're objective. You can all make up your minds as to who pays, but that's a big question. And then how do they pay? So that's something that they're working on now. And then they also introduced this idea that, well, utilities don't have a whole lot of incentive to do this stuff, so maybe we should have these measurements and measure the utilities, and if they help move things move forward, they'll get some money for that. So they're contemplating that, and the utilities are supposed to propose those types of things through different rate filings. The second part of this is I have a big plus sign there up on the right-hand side. In the beginning, when they did this Track 2 order that came out, the utilities were only going to have an upside. But everybody knows that there's going to also be a downside if they don't make their measurements. So that's sort of an interesting thing that's going to happen. Right now, and this is almost through all the process that's going on, right now what's happening is they're in the middle of having another 3 working groups. One is to address low and medium income customers, and we don't want to not have them participate. And so the working group is trying to determine how they can get these customers more engaged so that if they're renting a facility, they're not opening their windows while the air conditioning's on and that kind of thing. How do you get the low and medium income customers more engaged and knowledgeable? Something called value stack, which says you don't implement one technology only for one reason. There may be multiple benefits for implementing some technology. And then rate design, which could impact you if you were a New York customer, and eventually it's actually working in Pennsylvania now. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, where there's some stuff going on where you have a different look on how you're charged. And so they're looking at creative ways so that customers have choices on how you will be charged. And then you can save money in some ways, in other ways perhaps not. So that's the process. I'm just going to pause. Any questions? Because that's really what's going on in New York, and I'm going to talk about some of their programs, but any questions so far? Yes?
Can you say what the MedEd stands for?
So MedEd is a short answer for a Metropolitan Edison Company, which is a subsidiary of First Energy Company, which serves Pennsylvania. So the people in, some of the people in the Reading area are served by MedEd. Anything else? Yes, sir.
I need a short answer though, because we could talk about this a long time.
Sure.
What's the role of the balancing authority in New York to bring these companies to, consistency in their distribution logistics?
The role of the balancing authority?
Yeah. Independent operator.
Oh, okay. So they're still working on dispatching at the transmission level. That would be their role. Some people think they would be interested in doing the distribution level too, but nothing has been decided. Okay? But you're right. I mean, there has to be some way to coordinate the dispatching of the utility scale with the smaller one, and that's still being worked out. Okay? All right, so we'll move on, and I'll talk about some of the individual programs going on in New York. When this first got initiated, New York has a state research organization, not for profit, it's a government authority, who actually has access to hundreds of millions of dollars for energy program. Essentially, they pass through some dollars from the utility bills to this organization to make sure that research is done. So one of the things that NYSERDA, that's the name of the organization, came up with is something called New York Prize. And basically what it's doing is encouraging microgrids. So some of you may not know what a microgrid is. Let's talk about that. Essentially, we actually have had little microgrids on the system ever since the beginning of electricity, okay? But they weren't necessarily called that. It's when you can have some kind of generation at your local area and you have the ability to detach from the utility company. So if you think about sometimes like hospitals, wastewater treatment plants, some emergency types of facilities, they may have their own generation there as backup, and if something happens, they go to that backup and they can potentially detach themselves from the utility if the grid starts to go down. Why? Because we need our hospitals running in emergencies, and if the grid's going down, you need them to continue to go. So those are like the smaller scale microgrids. What New York was trying to do across the state is essentially encourage communities to think about formulating their own microgrid. And that would mean that they would probably implement some kind of solar. They would include perhaps energy storage. These are options, not everything. They could put a diesel generator involved in it. They could have all kinds of options in which they could detach from the grid and make their own electricity and distribute it among themselves. So what New York NYSERDA did, said, okay, we're going to have a contest. Any community that comes forward and applies, if you have a decent plan and you have your partners in place, NYSERDA will give each community $100,000 to do a feasibility study. And what that means is the feasibility study would say, for this community, given the design and what you're trying to plan, thumbs up, this is a good idea, or thumbs down, you really don't have your plan, or the plan really isn't going to work. And so in phase one, that was the feasibility studies, each community $100,000 if they pass the test. Phase two is taking a subset of that and anyone else that qualified and say we're going to put $1 million and put it through engineering and design. And then phase three, they're not yet at, is they're going to actually build the microgrid. So in this slide, you can see where they actually selected the sites for the feasibility studies. And the ones in yellow are all the communities that applied and got $100,000 to do a feasibility study. The yellow ones are phase one. There were, I think, I'm not going to quote, there were 83 total between phase one and phase two. Most of them were done in phase one. Phase one is over. They have a few handfuls, some of the green up there, you can see them sporadically, were actually allowed in phase 2, and now there's 11 communities that have been selected for the next phase, which is the engineering building, and they're each getting, I believe it's $1 million to do that study. Yes?
Is that a mix of residential, commercial, industrial, or is it favor one or the other segment?
So each community actually put their plan together, and they're all very different because each community has a different saturation of perhaps an industrial customer or a college or some serving residential customers that they could do. But it was some kind of central place where they would install this new distributed energy renewables resources so that they could actually detach from the grid as an answer to Hurricane Sandy and say, okay, in this situation, we can run our own electricity. We have this system working, okay? All right, so that's the New York Prize, and they're in the middle of that. Another thing that our company got very involved with, we're involved a little bit in the microgrid analysis, is something called hosting capacity. Now this is a little bit technical, but I want you to understand it because it's very important if you're ever interested in installing solar that you understand this concept. Essentially, let me give you a layman's terms of the wires that you see out on the street were essentially planned for electricity to go one way, from the large scale generation to your home or to a business. And so all the technology that was installed for that was planned that it would go one way. And in fact, there were a lot of controls put on those wires such that, let's say there's a business in the area, they had motors, all kinds of technology within that business, that if there would be some kind of reaction from that business that would make a surge of some kind to go backwards and impact the neighboring customers, the system was built to stop that. So you would not be impacted by your neighbor doing something on the electric system. Well, guess what? The whole system was designed that way. And now we're encouraging people to put generation at their own locations, whether it's a home or a business, and feed that back to the utility. Well, what does that mean? Basically, the system has to be designed to do that, and things have to be changed. So, especially in the case of solar PV, there's surges on the system that may negatively impact that distribution wire system. And so, if solar PV gets to be so much on that system, there could be surges and it would negatively impact the neighboring customers. Now, I don't know about you, but it was probably 10, 15, 20 years ago that remember when we had digital clocks and if there was a surge on the system, you had to reset all your clocks. Remember that? Well, we sort of got away from that because the utilities started to invest more and more into the system to stop that type of thing. So, with the hosting capacity, what we do is we actually study each of those feeder distribution lines and say how much solar PV can be put on the line before it makes your neighbor does something negative to the system. And what that's called is basically a failure on the system. And so we look at the different system and say, okay, you know, can it take this much PV or can it take that much solar PV? And I'm going to hurry through these because I know you're not all technical people. But essentially what it came down to is we had to go to the state of New York, since they wanted to encourage all of this research out there and everybody installing things, and actually demonstrate where the right areas or the beneficial areas that it would help the system, and where were the areas where it would be very costly to the system because all of these adjustments would have to be made on the distribution lines. So we made these hosting capacity maps. They're still in the process of doing this. They have to basically do the entire state and evaluate where these lines are. And if you notice, on these maps, there's red, green, and yellow. Well, it's just like a traffic light. In the red area, that's where if you added more solar PV, it would be a lot of cost that the adjustments would have to be made, okay? And so if somebody's trying to sell solar PV to a community, that's not the community to go to. Because what would happen is you not only would be responsible for purchasing the solar PV panels on your house, but in order to connect up to the utility, there would be other costs because you do not want to hurt your neighbor, okay? The yellow area, it depends on how much it is, and in the green area, go ahead. We could use the capacity in the area and the system can take it. Every single feeder, every single distribution line has to be evaluated for that. So anytime you add your solar PV, the utility has to evaluate that. Why? To hurt you? No. To make sure your neighbor's not hurt. And they're responsible for the reliability to every customer. Another thing that happened, this is a very beneficial thing. This is up in New York City, Brooklyn, Queens area. This is a very famous thing going on in New York. It's all across the United States now as the example to go by. But in the Brooklyn, Queens neighborhood, you know, Brooklyn's an up and coming. Everybody's going to Brooklyn. Well, that makes the demand go up for electricity. And so what Con Edison up there thought, oh my gosh, at that particular location in the substation, they're going to have to upgrade that because of all this new customer and new technology. Guess what the cost of that upgrade of that substation would be? Over $1 billion for one substation. So they said, you know what, this doesn't even make sense anymore. And they knew REV was in the works, and they said, we have an idea. Instead of upgrading that substation and building onto all of these things, why don't we create a virtual power plant? Why don't we put a bid out and ask people that do demand response, people that have energy storage, people that have energy efficiency, solar PV companies, we'll ask them to bid, and if they can give us what we need for the demand of that area, instead of upgrading the substation for $1 billion, we can do this. And guess how much that should cost? Their estimate was $300 million. A third of the cost. I think it's a good idea. They brought it to the PSC. The PSC said, we like it. And now in New York, each of the utilities have to file what they call non-wires alternatives. This example, and say, all your upgrades that you're anticipating, you have to do an analysis to say, is it better to upgrade the system on the utility side, or is it better to bid out, and what's the cost benefit of each? And a lot of them are bidding it out. Yes? So very good. So they actually had a series of bids from Con Edison. The first RFP that went out, a lot of the bids came in as energy efficiency programs and just demand response. And New York said, you know what, we want this to be further than that. So then they were asked to do another series of bids, which they're just finalizing from what I understand. In fact, the two pictures on here show the examples of some of the installations they made. And it incorporated energy storage. And I'm in the energy storage group now at my company, so I happen to get access to these pictures. But these are Con Edison installations, and they put in these large batteries. You can see, let's see, the one on the left is a 2 megawatt battery, but the one on the right are, I think, a series, oh, that's the solar PV that was installed. So they had a lot of diversity that was put into this Brooklyn Queens demand management program, and there's a lot of experimentation going, but I think it's working, and they call it a clean virtual power plant. Takes a lot of organization, but it's a nice solution. But just remember something too. Batteries can only be used for so many hours in the day before they have to recharge. Remember that, it's not 24-hour. Remember, if you're going to use solar, the sun only shines at certain times, and especially in New York City, where are you going to put them on the rooftop? So there's a lot of complications here, and you have to study. The other thing that happened in New York REV is the pilots. And what's interesting about this is my company usually does research on technology. What these pilots did in New York was essentially really looking at new business models. So instead of just doing the technology research, what they've asked the utilities to do in their pilots is new business models. And a requirement of every single pilot here was that they had to bring a third party as a partner into the pilot. So they had to bring maybe solar companies in or some other kind of company in, and they had to partner. Now, what did that do? Well, it introduced new ideas. And second of all, economic development, new jobs in New York. So there were quite a few benefits to these pilots, and they're really just getting started. It took them a year or two just to approve them all, and now they're implementing them. I have, that's interesting. All right, let's see if I can do that. I have in the presentation.
Oh, could you go back?
Sure. Yeah.
I was just wondering, could you explain what a BCA for a societal test is?
Okay, thank you. So a BCA is the benefit cost analysis. And one of the things that the New York did throughout this whole process was say, you can't just put anything in. You have to have some kind of financial test that this makes sense. What's the business model? And so they put a framework in place that said, okay, we're going to use these rules to say whether the dollar answer that you come up with, you have to use these rules and procedures to analyze this. And that's called the benefit cost analysis that was done for every single pilot to say, yes, thumbs up, or no, thumbs down. It's worth doing, or it's not. You just can't spend money indiscriminately, can you? Well, I don't. Yes.
What's important there is that that's a different test than they typically use for ratepayers.
That's correct.
Utilities are usually responded to what's best for the ratepayers. So it's got to be economically more beneficial to the ratepayer specifically than what it costs to do. The societal test means it's better for society as a whole.
Yes.
So it opens it up to a lot more positive things that traditionally the Utility Commission did not allow the utilities to consider when they were making these decisions.
That's a really good point. So what he's saying is traditionally utilities used a test called the ratepayers test that said, I am paying money to the utility, it has to benefit me and make sure my costs stay down. They opened this up in the new framework to say, let's try these pilots, but it has to prove what's called the societal test. It benefits society, but you as a ratepayer, you may pay a little bit more. So that's a big issue, and thank you for bringing that up, because that was a big changeover in how they evaluated these pilots. And sometimes that is worth it to do new things for new technology, but you have to test it, and then you decide after you do the test whether it's worth it to do it wide scale or not. And that's a policy issue, and I'm not going to say what's right or wrong there. So when you get the slides from this, I have all the different pilots listed, but I'm afraid I'll run out of time. So just feel free to take a look at the slides. There's also a lot of resources I have available if you want to go on the websites and see things. That'll be in the slides also. There's all kinds of stuff. There's one up in the Buffalo Niagara area. I think it's on this slide. Yes, the Fruit Belt neighborhood. So that was for low and medium income customers who could not afford to do distributed energy resources on their own individually. So it's basically a community program that'll pay back and have these customers benefit from having the solar energy storage installed there. And so this pilot is putting in place that technology for the benefit of that community, and hopefully the community then can afford the electricity a little bit better. Another thing that's going on is the data. One thing in New York that's a little bit behind Pennsylvania is that they didn't have advanced meters on their customer locations, so they didn't really know, or they weren't checking how much customers were using every 15 minutes. Whereas here, I'm pretty sure PPL and MedEd have those meters on our facilities and locations now. So they're just really building that database up in New York, which means they can't go as fast because they don't have the data to do it. They can't evaluate what it'll help each customer. So they're just catching up with some of that. Other things going on is a K-Solar program. They've implemented solar PV at grade schools. It's actually K to 12th grade schools statewide to go solar. So that's a little change I have to make there. New York Sun is helping to finance 3,000 megawatts of solar projects to low and moderate income communities. Build Smart New York is the state government saying that all their government office buildings have to cut energy use by 20% in 2020. And a caveat here, I'm going to show this to you. energy use, not necessarily electricity. So I just want to make sure that's clear. And the New York Green Bank was formed. It's a big financing, a lot of money going into NYSERDA, lots and lots of money to invest. I have in the slides here the resources. You can go to those websites and dig up deeper. But I did want to get to industry trends and discussion. We only have about 10 minutes left, so just real quick. Our company, I just talked about this. I said, we're doing an analysis, and if you are going to be more efficient, which is column 1 there, the red arrow going down, and are you going to reduce CO2 emissions in the air, that actually the plan really has is increasing electricity, which is the third bar, which is the green one going up. So total energy may go down, but electricity will go up to be more efficient. And so we have to prepare for that because that electricity is going to come from all these resources we just talked about. Another thing going on you might be interested in is across the country where grid modernization is going on, what states. They have Pennsylvania listed. Pennsylvania is basically focusing on rates and rate design, not necessarily the grid modernization, but oh, isn't that interesting? I just got hooked up to the internet somehow, okay? Sorry about that. Yes. But Pennsylvania is considered in the top 10. They're not in the top 5, but top 10 as far as advancement, so we got to be good about that. Pennsylvania legislation, there's a House Bill 1782 that's going on, and it has to do with those rate alternatives and different ways in which distribution companies could charge their customers. So they're looking at different opportunities and options. And then also, this comes from the testimony of your vice chair of your Pennsylvania, our Public Utility Commission. It talks about the regulation and legislation and what's going on with DER. So I'm just going to quickly go over that right-hand side because I think it's important. What's going on in Pennsylvania? Well, you got distributed generation, which is mostly talked about with the combined heat and power. And that's when you have industrial companies that may be able to use their heat to help generate electricity. It's more efficient. So Pennsylvania is really proposing a lot of that. They're doing a good job with that. The solar installations in Pennsylvania increased 53% from May 2016 to 2017. You may not know that. Distribution companies are looking at electric vehicles. The one he mentions in his testimony is PECO. And they have an EV program that they're doing with different pools and lots of different options there. And then energy storage, I wanted to mention this because energy storage is, to me, the game changer. If energy storage moves forward, then you can do just about anything because you can store electricity, and then you may not even need the utilities because then you could use this, solar, store it, and then go. We're doing a lot of studies on that. In fact, I'm a project manager for a study that looks at solar PV combined with energy storage, and still need a diesel generator because the sun doesn't always shine and energy storage is only available for so many hours. So, it sounds good and you say, oh, let's everybody go solar. Okay, when the sun's not out, what are you going to do? You still have to have that, and just remember that. So they're having stakeholder meetings in PUC over all those issues. Just real quick, solar PV, the prices are going down. This goes from 1976 to projected out almost to 2025. And because of that, they're getting more solar PV installed. So the price goes down, more people will want to do it. Other energy storage, there's mandates. California has one out, Massachusetts, New York now is coming out with one, and Oregon. They're saying they have to have so many installations. They're actually mandating the utilities to implement this. Energy storage battery deployments, you can see there on the left. Oh gosh, I really need my glasses now. So in the green, it looks like the residential. The red is non-residential, and then, no, the green is utility, that's right. And residential is hardly anything. Somebody asked me before the meeting, why aren't they doing more residential? Because it costs more. It costs more to educate people, it costs more for the technology, and they don't have that down to a science. It's not that it's not going to come, but they experiment with the big guys first, it's less costly, and then you can implement it, okay? And that's it. So I'd like to open it up to any last questions you may have. I hope I didn't bore you too much, and I hope you're more informed. You can have a discussion about what's going on in Pennsylvania, but that would be what you all think you should be doing. Any last questions or comments? There's two of you back there. We'll take one at a time. Go ahead.
Do you know if there's been any analysis so far as to how the recent tariff is going to affect prices with solar and then demand of it?
Has there been any study? I'm sorry.
Has there been any analysis of how the recent tariff for foreign solar panels, how that's going to affect prices and then demand for it?
Our company would probably be looking at that. I'm not sure they have come out with anything yet, but that would definitely be on the radar screen. And another resource besides our company is I found a lot of information. Some of those questions in the very beginning were from the DOE. There's a lot of information the DOE has out there. I'd recommend you go look and take a look at that. The other gentleman?
I want to know about sort of the net metering too in New York and how that's being framed out.
Okay, so I don't know the results yet of the net metering. I think they did come out. I just didn't get that far to study where they are with it. But just for the rest of you on this net metering, it really go back to that example I gave you on the solar. So we love the fact that people are trying new technologies, but the idea of how the customer pays for it is really interesting in paying for your electricity. So it goes back to traditionally, as a customer, we're billed on what's called a kilowatt hour basis. They add up the number of kilowatt hours you used at the end of the month, and that's what you pay. And for residential customers in particular, for us, the common person, we don't really pay a whole lot of attention to when we use it. But if you think about it, the infrastructure or the line is really built for the one time when everybody needs it. That's what they have to have that capacity for. So what's happening in the history to the present is, and I used to be a director of rates, so I sort of understand this a little bit, is you have to sort of balance this whole idea of most people really don't understand electricity, and so you have to make their bills pretty easy at the end of the month. And it's the larger customers that you would necessarily perhaps split up their bill and say, okay, we're not only going to charge you for how much you use at the end of the month, but we're also going to charge you for exactly the highest 15 minutes, what you use during that time during the month. So large customers can pretty much monitor that, okay? And they pay accordingly, and they won't make their what they call peak times too high because they'll have a higher bill. But as a residential customer, we're really not caught up to the technology that can help manage that for us so that if we make a mistake, our bill doesn't triple. And the problem is now that when you have solar PV coming online, when people are generating their own electricity and they want to use the lines going the opposite way, if they're only charged by kilowatt hour, if I'm a residential customer, I put a solar PV panel on my house, and I'm only paying for how much I used at the end of the month. If I didn't use anything and I basically used all the solar PV, my bill would be like nothing. But if I'm sending energy back to the utility, I'm using those lines. So there has to be a way to actually charge for that, because whoever is causing the cost should pay for it. Now, everybody blames the utility when their bills go up and they don't like the way the bills are assessed. What I'm just going to tell you right now is once the utility, it determines how much money the utility is going to get by a commission, the idea of who pays is a dilemma because nobody wants to pay it. And so that's why utilities go into rate cases, and there's so many different parties to the case saying, well, you should pay more and I have to pay less, and you should pay more and I have to pay less. And really, I would say that the regulators and the utilities are the ones trying to balance all that out and do what's fair to everybody, but also do what's practical. So the example I use is I'm pretty knowledgeable about my electricity usage, and I could probably monitor it myself. And my two sisters and my brother-in-law are in the room, and they know my mother is 88 years old. She does not have electric heat. She does not have an electric water heater. Her bill is pretty darn small, and she uses it for her lights, her television. And to introduce a concept to her that she may have to pay for the highest 15 kW in the month first of all, is pretty small in the scheme of things, and the cost to educate a person like my mother may not be worth it. It would cost more than what the benefits would be. So this is the dilemma, because we are in a generational phase where maybe the younger generation will be educated enough, but and people that are using so little, they may not have as much of an impact. Is it really worth spending a lot of money to educate them? The answer, I have no idea. We all have to figure that out together as to what we want to do in the future, as well as what's reasonable and practical and cost effective. There's no easy answer to that. Yes, sir.
For your average electricity consumer, forgetting about solar feeding electricity back to the grid, how is that grid paid for currently?
Okay, now this goes back to my rate days. So how that's paid for is the utility goes to the PSC or PUC in Pennsylvania. They file a rate case and they say, okay, here's our costs. And everybody goes through what those costs are. There's different parties that analyze that. And they say, okay, we need an increase of $300 million, okay? So then what happens is that same utility has analysts, and I used to do this when I first started in 1981, is we would take a look at different profiles of different customer types and when they used the electricity. And we would allocate the cost depending on when they used it. So for instance, if customers use more during the peak times and the company had to pay more, install more generation, then those customers should pay a little bit more than those customers that do not have to pay. So right now, and I'm not sure MedEd and PPL, I haven't looked at their bills and their options lately, but right now, typically residential customers will pay more once and done at the end of the month, whatever your total energy usage was. They add it up from the meter. I think they probably have some options that are time of use that says, okay, I might get a break if I monitor my energy between on and off peak hours. Commercial and industrial customers not only pay that kilowatt hour charge, and they pay a little bit less, but they also pay for the peak time that they use during the month, because they're larger and more facilities had to be built for them. On the other hand, if you ever notice, and this is very complicated, so I apologize, but the difference between industrial rates, commercial rates, and residential rates, you may think is unfair and say, oh, those industrial customers are getting a break. Well, guess what? The industrial customers are only using the transmission lines. There are no distribution lines built for those big customers, so they shouldn't have to pay for that. And so they don't pay as much for those facilities because it's the residential and the small commercial customers that get paid for that. Did that answer? I mean, you asked a pretty general question. I don't know if that, go ahead.
Does the average residential user get a small piece of their monthly bill that goes towards paying for the wire?
Oh, yes. In fact, depending on the company, it may be almost half the bill. Yes, sir.
In that community, I think it was a community microgrid kind of concept.
Yes.
Some of those pilots.
Yes.
Were those players allowed to participate in the energy markets, or did they have to go and were going to be restricted by whatever rate making came in?
Yeah, they could participate. In fact, one of the benefits, if you did the cost-benefit analysis, was they may be able to buy and sell to the New York ISO, which is PJM in Pennsylvania, but the one dispatching the utility generation, and they could buy and sell from that because it was a big enough entity. You had to be a certain size to do that because if you have so many little ones, it's just too hard to control, which is sort of the new future that we're really looking to do, if you think about it. Yes, sir.
Becky, in the microgrids,
Mm-hmm.
if an individual has solar panels
Mm-hmm.
on their roof,
Mm-hmm.
New York is, I believe, going to actually use the concept that they could sell their excess to their next door neighbor using blockchain technology. Right?
That's a potential. I haven't been following the New York specifics lately on that, but it's a potential all over the nation. That, in fact, I just saw an example where there were 2 homes that decided they were going to share an energy storage unit, and they had an example of that. And I thought, boy, that's going to be interesting as to who pays what and when they pay. Let them figure it out for a change. But yes, there's all kinds of different options that could be done. And this is the creativity part of how you explore and what works and what doesn't. Vera?
Yeah, but I wondered if you could go back to the slide with the scenarios on it.
This-
And I was interested to hear how this plan is doing on reaching the emissions targets of 80% by 20, you just passed it.
All right, let's see. All the way back? Is that what you're thinking? The scenario,
Yeah, I know.
I did pass it?
Two arrows down. Yeah.
Oh, the one we're doing. Okay,
No,
hold on, I know where it is.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
That's okay, right there. Uh-huh.
If you could talk about the emissions targets and how, what you're learning and how that's working out in New York so far? And how New York thinks it's doing as far as being on track for 2050 and 80% reduction?
Okay, so I will not consider myself the expert in this, but I have observed some things. So New York has had some targets for quite a while in the state. And New York is very different with its policy from Pennsylvania. So they're pretty anti-fossil fuels, even gas at this point. And so they were part of the RGGI collaborative. They had RPS standards. They had renewable portfolio standards put in place to address the emissions years ago. It was only in the last couple of years with REV that I really saw targets that they were going after. And then I had heard that depending on what your definition was of whether nuclear is considered renewable or hydro is considered to be renewable, you know, you could say you made your target or you didn't make your target. So that's all I'll say on the matter. I'm not sure they progressed as fast as they wanted to, and I know for New York REV, they really wanted to move forward with distributed energy resources, and that first couple of years, they thought they were going to be there. I wanted to mention that too, because I think part of the delay was the stakeholder issue, but there's two other pieces that I don't think that they anticipated that you have to anticipate. One is they had a lot of companies come to them and say, oh, we have this technology ready, you'll be able to use this. The technology wasn't ready. There were a lot of companies that basically, you know, said, oh, we can, our energy storage, our solar, we can do all of this. And then when they put it in the ground and they tested it, it didn't work right away. So then they had another 6 months of testing and revising things and that kind of thing. So the technology was part of the holdup. And then also not anticipating all of the issues having to do with making sure that customers still get reliable service, and the distribution system had to be changed. And so there was a lot of things that weren't anticipated. Of course there will be. Whenever you try anything new, you're not going to anticipate all the issues. So, you know, I acknowledge that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but it did delay the process, and that was one of the things. So there's a lot of goals out there. There's a lot of things that people want to achieve. I think that there is good progress being made, but depending on how you define it, it's very interesting. And even the U.S. came out with some goals a couple years ago. I don't know if this administration's still pursuing those, but you know, it depended on the state. It depended on the back then a couple of years ago, it depended on the state, it depended on where you were, and they just, you know, basically gave goals, and people didn't even know how they were going to achieve them. I mean, it was almost impossible, depending on how it was done. So that was sort of interesting. Anything else? Yes, sir.
One of the challenges to solar and other distributed energy resources has been, I don't want to say the roadblock, but the concern on the part of the utilities of how that cost impacts the whole system.
Mm-hmm.
Has any type of study been done, or are we at the point where we can understand what the impact is on cost of electricity from the utility standpoint, from the distribution standpoint, of, you know, dramatic increases in distributed energy?
Mm-hmm. So that's part of the process in New York of why it's taking a little bit longer. So the utilities had to file these implementation plans if I got the year right, I think it was 2016. They were supposed to be this future-looking thing about what their plans were. They're going to file them, I think it's every other year, but that first filing was really a summary of what they have currently and all the different things that needed to be done, and they were just starting to evaluate the costs of that. And so there's a price to be paid, and there's a balancing scale that you have to. Everybody wants clean energy, but everybody wants low bills. And so you have to give and take and figure out what's the right balance in our society that we as a society need, and then the regulators and the legislators go forth and figure out what that balance is. I think there was a question. Joe, did you have one?
Yeah, is New York State, through this program, are they the only state that is looking at a line by line or neighborhood by neighborhood?
No, they're just the beginning part of it. Some of the other states are really looking. I know California is pretty big on some of this too. Another issue that came up in Hawaii, for instance, is everybody put solar PV on their homes, and they didn't have necessarily the winter requirements, but what happened was there was such a small segment of customers left that was actually using the utility, and their bills went sky high because there's hardly anybody to share the costs with. So that was sort of interesting because the solar were off-grid. Yes?
Just a quick follow-up on the other part. Is the cost of carbon being factored into any of these growth programs?
Yes.
Have they talked about a number yet?
Yeah, and that goes back to the societal benefit, that they want to include everything. You know, are we addressing, if you remember in the very beginning, there were all those goals for New York, and some of that was lowering emissions, so forth and so on. So when they came up with this cost-benefit framework, they said, we want to look at all of that and have that all included.
Well, the cost of carbon will really make the solar look better when you start factoring in.
That's correct. I mean, if you take a look at solar and wind, it's a very low cost when you actually, you know, basically, after you get the installation in, the actual ongoing energy is very low. But then you have to take into account the fact that it's making other changes to the system, and that should be included also. So yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to see the trends of the costs. I don't have a slide here to share with you on that, but we also are evaluating what's the highest cost, what's the lowest cost, you know, as time goes by. And those lines are starting to intersect and change over time.
A lot of those utilities that were doing the REV pilots
Mm-hmm.
specifically excluded diesel generation from an option in your approach.
They may have, that's right.
They did.
Yeah, because the whole idea of doing the pilot was for the renewable clean energy and not to, I mean, New York already had a CHP program that was pretty far advanced, so really it wasn't going to advance anything related to that. As well as New York is really, I mean, they even have issues on emissions on burning wood in upstate New York, because there's emissions involved with that. So, I mean, they're looking at everything. Yes, sir.
Hi, you mentioned earlier in the talk about wind being the cheapest form of renewable
Mm-hmm.
now. What's New York doing with wind?
Some of this is confidential, so I can't tell you everything, but I do know of some companies that are looking at offshore wind and some major projects there. And it really depends on who the companies are, what they're allowed to own. So remember that New York is like Pennsylvania, it's deregulated, but in New York, they're not allowed to own generation. And so it's the utilities that may not be building them, with the exception of, for instance, the New York Power Authority is a government utility that's not regulated, and they would be allowed to own wind generation, just like they're allowed to own the Niagara plant, the hydro plant there. But all the other utilities basically had to get rid of their generation, and they're not allowed to own it to allow for more competition in New York for generation purposes.
Wow.
Anything else? Well, I appreciate your, oh my goodness, it's almost 8:30, so I appreciate your attention. I hope I didn't bore you, and thank you so much. Thank you.
This way I see. Please join us for snacks and chit chat. Help yourselves.
You're gonna go.
They